Okay, stop scrolling. Stop whatever you're doing right now because I need about 12 minutes of your attention and it might genuinely matter this week. Last night, right around 9 p.m. Eastern, a line of storms rolled through southeast Ohio and western West Virginia, and it put down at least 2 confirmed tornado warnings, not watches, warnings, in the dark, while a lot of people were already asleep. I was watching the radar trends on that cell near Huntington, and I want to be straight with you. That was just the appetizer. That was Monday night. What's coming the rest of this week is bigger, it's going to cover more ground, and it's going to bring 2 separate threats that I need you to take equally seriously. Tornadoes, yes, but also flash flooding. That, I think, is honestly the sneakier and more dangerous piece of this whole setup. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to walk you through exactly what's fueling this day by day from today, Tuesday the 11th, through the weekend. I'm going to explain the atmospheric ingredients in plain English so you actually understand why I'm concerned. And not just take my word for it. And at the end, I'm going to tell you exactly what I want you to do about it, because a forecast that doesn't change your behavior isn't worth anything. Let's get into it. Before we go day by day, I want to zoom out, because context matters here. This has been an unusually active severe weather year. We are running well ahead of the typical pace of enhanced and moderate risk days from the Storm Prediction Center, and the pattern we're locked into right now, a moist axis stretching from the Central Plains through the lower Ohio Valley, underneath a ridge that keeps nosing eastward and then getting knocked back by short waves, is exactly the kind of pattern that produces multi-day outbreaks instead of one clean event and then it's over. That's the first thing I want you to understand about this week. This is not a single-day tornado outbreak scenario like you'd get with a classic springtime dryline setup in Oklahoma. This is a multi-day train of disturbances riding along a boundary that's basically going to sit on top of the Ohio Valley and Mid-Atlantic through the weekend. Every single day, the ingredients reload. That's what makes this dangerous. Not necessarily the ceiling on any one day, but the fact that the same corridor of real estate is going to get hit and re-hit night after night, and the ground underneath it is going to run out of room to absorb any more water. I'll be watching this the whole way through, and I'm going to be honest with you about what I don't know yet, because there's real uncertainty in exactly where the axis of heaviest rain sets up on Thursday and Friday. But the overall shape of this pattern, that part I'm confident in. Let's start with today, because it's already unfolding as I'm recording this. We've got a complex of thunderstorms that's been rolling generally east-southeast, and the National Weather Service offices from the mid-Mississippi Valley into the Ohio Valley and central Appalachians have already flagged today as a wind and flash flood day. If you're in Kentucky, southern Ohio, West Virginia, or western Virginia, you're under an increased risk of severe storms this afternoon and evening, primarily for damaging straight-line winds, with localized flash flooding riding shotgun on top of that. Here's the mechanism. We've got what's called a mesoscale convective system. That's just a cluster or a line of thunderstorms that's organized itself into one cohesive blob that can maintain itself for 6, 8, sometimes 12 plus hours, way longer than any single thunderstorm cell could survive on its own. These systems are notorious overnight and early morning producers of damaging wind because they generate their own outflow, cold air rushing out ahead of the storm. And when that outflow undercuts the warm, unstable air in front of it, it can actually accelerate the whole system and produce what we call a bow echo, where the line of storms literally bows outward on radar like an archer's bow. When you see that shape, that's when you get your highest wind gust potential, sometimes 70, 80 miles an hour in the core of the bow. Today, spotters across parts of North Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia have already been put on alert. And a flood watch is up because rainfall totals in some of these training storm scenarios, where storm after storm moves over the exact same path, like train cars on a track, can add up fast even without any single storm being that impressive on its own. Meanwhile, farther west and south, it is a different kind of dangerous today. We've got heat advisories in effect across the central and southern plains, heat index values pushing 106 in spots like the Dallas-Fort Worth area, with actual air temperatures in the upper 90s to around 102. That heat is not just a comfort issue, it's fuel. Warm, humid air at the surface is the raw ingredient that moisture is going to get pulled north and east over the next few days as this pattern evolves. So keep that heat in the back of your mind. It's not a separate story from the storm threat. It's part of the same story. Wednesday is where I want you to start paying closer attention because the flood threat ramps up noticeably. The moist axis I mentioned, think of it as a river of humid air at the surface running from the Central Plains southeast into the lower Ohio Valley, stays anchored in almost the exact same corridor. That's the problem. When the same air mass sits over the same ground for multiple consecutive days, and that air mass keeps producing thunderstorms, You get saturated soils, rising creeks, and a much lower threshold for flash flooding on day 2 and 3 than you had on day 1. Areas of northwest North Carolina and southwest Virginia that got heavy rain Tuesday are specifically flagged for an increased risk of both severe storms and localized flash flooding again on Wednesday. That's the training effect I just described. Same general zone getting hit twice. From an instability standpoint, we're looking at moderate to strong values along that moist axis, what meteorologists track as MUC-AP, or most unstable convective available potential energy. I don't want to just throw that term at you and move on, because understanding it actually helps you understand why some days are scarier than others. CAPE is essentially a measurement of how much energy is available for a parcel of air to rise explosively once it gets going. Think of it like the amount of gasoline sitting in the tank. The most unstable part means we're not just looking at the air right at the surface. We're looking at the most unstable layer anywhere in the lower atmosphere, because sometimes the most explosive fuel source isn't right at ground level. It's 1,000 or 2,000 feet up, especially on days with some cloud cover or a stable layer hanging around near the surface. On Wednesday, that fuel is sitting there. Isolated to scattered severe thunderstorms will be possible each afternoon and evening as that instability builds with the daytime heating. And the greatest severe threat sets up near the Ohio Valley into the central Appalachians once again. Thursday is a transition day, and this is where I want to slow down and actually explain the mechanics, because this is the piece that separates a casual weather watcher from someone who actually understands what's about to happen to their neighborhood. A mid-level ridge, high pressure aloft, is forecast to shift eastward through the north-central U.S. on Thursday. Normally, ridges suppress storms. They're associated with sinking air, which caps off thunderstorm development. But here's the catch, and it's the same dynamic I want every one of you to understand going forward, not just this week. A ridge can act like a lid on a pot of boiling water. The moisture and instability keep building underneath it, and if that lid weakens or gets punctured by a disturbance moving through, all that pent-up energy releases at once, and you can go from a quiet afternoon to severe storms exploding within an hour. That's essentially the setup for Thursday and into Friday. A mid-level shortwave trough, a disturbance that provides lift and helps break that capping inversion, is forecast to move through the northern plains and then the mid-Atlantic on Friday. When that trough interacts with the instability that's been building underneath the retreating ridge, that's your ignition point. I also want to talk about the cap directly, because it's one of the most misunderstood concepts in severe weather forecasting. And it's exactly the kind of thing that decides whether a day busts or becomes historic. The cap is a layer of warm air sitting above the surface that acts like a lid, preventing rising thermals from breaking through and becoming full-blown thunderstorms. And when the cap is strong, you can have huge amounts of instability sitting there, completely untapped, like a pressure cooker. If the cap holds all day, you might get nothing. But if something punches through it, daytime heating strong enough to erode it, or a disturbance aloft providing extra lift, all of that stored energy releases explosively, often in a narrow window in the late afternoon or evening. That's why forecasters get nervous on marginal cap days. It's an all-or-nothing scenario, and when it goes fast and it goes strong. On Thursday, expect isolated severe thunderstorms mainly in the afternoon and evening hours across the moist axis, with the flash flood threat continuing wherever training storms set up again over already saturated ground. Friday is the day in this sequence that has my full attention. And I want to explain exactly why using a term I mentioned briefly a second ago, the QLCS, or quasi-linear convective system. A QLCS is basically a squall line, a long, organized line of thunderstorms. But the quasi-linear part matters because these lines are rarely perfectly straight. They bulge, they break, they develop little kinks and bookend vortices along their length. And inside those kinks, especially where you get what's called a bowing segment, you can get embedded circulations. Small, often short, lived, often hard to warn on tornadoes that spin up along the leading edge of the line. These are fundamentally different from the classic supercell tornado you picture from Tornado Alley footage. QLCS tornadoes form fast. They're often rain-wrapped, so they're hard to see, and they can develop with very little lead time, sometimes just minutes between formation and touchdown. Here's why Friday specifically raises my concern for this mode of storm, with a shortwave trough moving through the mid-Atlantic on top of instability that's had days to accumulate along that moist corridor, and with soils already saturated from the earlier rounds this week, we've got the recipe for organized, fast-moving lines of storms rather than isolated cells. When storms organize into lines like that, straight-line wind damage becomes your primary widespread threat. But you also have to watch for those embedded QLCS circulations, because they don't always show up clearly on radar until they're already on the ground. This is also the day I'm watching the wind field aloft most closely, what we call shear, the change in wind speed and direction with height. Strong shear is what organizes storms into lines and helps sustain rotation within them. Without enough shear, storms tend to be pulse type, popping up and dying quickly, mostly just producing heavy rain and maybe some hail. With strong shear layered on top of decent instability, you get organized, longer-lived, more dangerous storm modes. Right now, the setup Friday looks like it has enough of both ingredients to support that kind of organized, severe weather, particularly from the mid-Atlantic back into the central Appalachians. And I want to say this clearly because I don't want to be alarmist without being specific. I'm not telling you Friday is guaranteed to be a major tornado outbreak day. I'm telling you the ingredients are lining up in a way that deserves your full attention, and that if you live anywhere from the Ohio Valley through the central Appalachians and into the mid-Atlantic, you should have a way to receive warnings that doesn't depend on you being awake and staring at your phone, because these systems can absolutely run into the overnight hours. By Saturday, the pattern begins to relax, but I don't want you tuning out yet, because Saturday still carries real risk, just in a slightly different location. Another mid-level shortwave trough is forecast to move through the Great Lakes region Saturday, and moderate to strong instability may still be in place across much of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio by the afternoon. Along the northern edge of that stronger instability, isolated severe thunderstorms will still be possible, stretching from lower Michigan eastward into the central Appalachians. By this point in the week, though, I want you to think less about any single dramatic tornado threat and more about cumulative impact. We will have had, by Saturday, 4 or 5 consecutive days of thunderstorm activity riding over largely the same stretch of the country. Rivers and creeks that were running low a week ago may be running high or even out of their banks by the weekend. Ground that could easily absorb an inch of rain on Tuesday may not be able to absorb a quarter inch by Saturday. This is exactly the mechanism behind flash flooding turning into more prolonged, dangerous river flooding. It's not always one big rain event. It's often the accumulation of several moderate events stacked too close together. I want to pause here and talk directly about something I think gets underweighted in a lot of severe weather coverage, including sometimes my own past coverage, if I'm honest with you. Tornadoes get the headlines, tornadoes get the dramatic video, but flash flooding kills people every single year in this country in numbers that rival or exceed tornado fatalities. And a huge percentage of those deaths happen in vehicles at night, when someone drives onto a road they've crossed 100 times before, not realizing that 6 inches of fast. Moving water is enough to sweep a car off the roadway, and 2 feet is enough to float it entirely. This week's setup is a textbook flash flood risk, not because any single storm is going to be historic, but because of that training storm effect I described. The same corridor getting hit repeatedly, day after day, from Tuesday through the weekend. When forecasters talk about precipitable water, or PWAT, they're essentially describing how much total moisture is packed into the entire depth of the atmosphere above a given spot. Imagine turning the whole atmospheric column into rain instantly and measuring how many inches would fall. When PWAT values run high, which they are along this moist axis this week, individual storms are simply more efficient rain producers. And when several of those efficient rain producers move over the same towns on back-to-back days, that's how you get flash flooding severe enough to close interstates and strand people in their homes. So here's my ask. Treat this like a co-equal threat to the tornado risk this week. If you live near a creek, a low-lying road, or in a floodplain anywhere from the Ohio Valley through the central Appalachians and mid-Atlantic, know your evacuation route now before you need it in the dark during a thunderstorm. I say this every time there's a multi-day setup like this, and I'm going to say it again because it matters more than any radar image I could show you. A forecast is worthless if it doesn't change what you do. First, get a way to receive warnings that works while you're asleep. A phone on silent doesn't wake you up for a tornado warning. A weather radio does. This matters enormously for this stretch specifically because several of the higher confidence severe threat windows this week run into the evening and overnight hours, and that Monday night tornado warning near Huntington I mentioned at the top happened at 9 o'clock at night, with more activity continuing after that. Second, if you're anywhere in that Ohio Valley to mid-Atlantic corridor, know where you'd go in your house if a tornado warning is issued. Lowest level, interior room, away from windows. Don't wait until the sirens are going to figure this out. Third, and I cannot stress this enough, turn around, don't drown. If you come up on a flooded roadway this week at any point, day or night, do not attempt to cross it. It doesn't matter if you've driven that road 1,000 times. Water moving at just a few miles an hour can push a vehicle off the road, and floodwaters at night are nearly impossible to judge by depth alone from your headlights. Fourth, if you're under a flood watch, which a lot of you are as of this recording, that doesn't mean flooding is definitely happening in your specific location. It means the environment supports it happening, and you should have a plan ready to execute quickly if a warning gets issued for your county specifically. So here's where we land. Today, Tuesday the 11th, we're dealing with a wind and localized flash flood threat centered on the Ohio Valley and Central Appalachians, riding on the front edge of a mesoscale convective system. Wednesday, that same corridor gets hit again with soils starting to saturate. Thursday, a weakening ridge lets pent-up instability start to break free as a shortwave approaches. Friday is the day I'm watching most closely, with the potential for an organized QLCS bringing widespread damaging wind and the risk of fast-forming embedded tornadoes across the mid-Atlantic and Central Appalachians. And Saturday, the threat shifts slightly north into the Great Lakes, while the flood risk downstream continues to be a concern from everything that fell earlier in the week. This is not a one-day story. This is not a watch the news tonight and you're in the clear tomorrow story. This is a full week where I need you paying attention, especially if you're anywhere along that Ohio Valley through Mid-Atlantic corridor. I'm going to be watching every one of these disturbances as they come through, and I'll have updates as we get closer to Thursday. And Friday, when confidence on exact placement gets sharper. If this was useful to you, get it in front of somebody in that corridor who needs to see it. Genuinely, that's how this stuff saves lives. Not just me saying it on a camera, but you sending it to your mom, your neighbor, whoever you know that's in the path. Stay weather aware, have a way to get warned even when you're asleep, and I'll see you back here with the next update. Take care of yourselves out there.